Picture this, a desperate telegraph message crackling through the wires of the Old West. "Send help, we're overrun!" But what happens when the help that arrives discovers that some towns carry secrets darker than the desert night itself? Today, I'm bringing you a tale of loyalty, betrayal, and redemption that will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last word. Before we dive into this gripping story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss the incredible stories we have coming your way. The telegraph key fell silent in Sheriff Tom Bradley's weathered hands, its final, desperate clicks echoing through the cramped office like gunshots. At 72, his arthritic fingers could barely grip his coffee cup, let alone a Colt 45. The message from Dry Hollow burned in his mind. "Send help, we're overrun! Town under siege, desperate, Mayor Harrison." Bradley's eyes drifted to the wanted posters yellowing on his wall, then to the man sitting quietly in the corner, methodically cleaning his revolver. Jake Morrison, silent as a grave, deadly as a rattlesnake, and the only soul in 3 counties who owed the old sheriff his life. The office was thick with the smell of gun oil and old leather, punctuated by the steady tick of the wall clock that had counted down Bradley's years of service. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Bradley had seen too many storms, both natural and man-made, to ignore the signs when trouble was brewing. "Jake," Bradley's voice cracked like old leather, "I need you to ride to Dry Hollow." Morrison looked up, his steel-grey eyes revealing nothing. 5 years ago, Bradley had found him half dead in the desert, a bullet in his shoulder and a noose around his neck, the sole survivor of a botched hanging. The sheriff never asked what Jake had done to deserve that rope, and Jake never offered to tell. But in those 5 years, Morrison had proven himself time and again, bringing in wanted men that other lawmen wouldn't even attempt to track. The scars on Morrison's neck were barely visible now, hidden beneath the collar of his black shirt, but Bradley knew they were there. Just as he knew that whatever demons drove Morrison to accept the most dangerous assignments were the same ones that made him the most reliable deputy he'd ever had. How far? Morrison's voice was barely above a whisper, each word measured and deliberate. 2 days, hard riding. Maybe less, if you push thunder. Bradley handed him the telegraph, noting how Morrison's calloused fingers handled the paper with surprising gentleness. "Town's under attack. They're asking for help." Morrison read the message twice, his expression unchanged. The lamplight cast deep shadows across his angular face, highlighting the premature lines around his eyes, marks of a man who'd seen too much violence for his 30-odd years. "What kind of attack?" "Don't know. Could be Apaches, could be bandits. Hell, could be anything out there." Bradley's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his desk drawer, the arthritis making even simple movements painful. "Take this." He pulled out a silver star, its surface worn smooth by decades of honest service. The badge had belonged to Bradley's predecessor, and his predecessor's predecessor, a symbol of law and order in a land where both were often in short supply. "You'll need the authority. Town might not trust a stranger." Morrison stared at the badge for a long moment, his fingers tracing the worn edges. The weight of it seemed heavier than mere silver, carrying with it the responsibility of every lawman who'd worn it before. "I ain't sheriff material, Tom. Maybe not. But you're the only man I trust to get the job done." Bradley's eyes held a weight that spoke of too many years, too many losses, too many good men who'd ridden out and never come back. "Those people are counting on us. On you." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers trying to claw their way in. Morrison stood slowly, his spurs chiming softly against the wooden floor like distant church bells. He pinned the star to his vest, the metal cold against his chest, feeling the weight of expectation settle on his shoulders like a familiar burden. "If I don't come back—" "You will," Bradley interrupted. But his voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. "You always do. Morrison gathered his gear in silence. Rifle, ammunition, enough supplies for a week in hostile territory. His movements were economical, practiced, those of a man who'd learned that preparation could mean the difference between life and death. As he reached the door, Bradley called out one last time, "Jake, whatever you find out there, remember, sometimes doing right ain't the same as following orders." Morrison paused, his hand on the doorknob, considering the weight of those words. In his experience, the line between right and wrong was often blurred by circumstances, and the law wasn't always just. "I'll remember." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Bradley alone with his ghosts and the dying light of day. Outside, Thunder's hooves drummed against the hard-packed earth, carrying Morrison toward a destiny neither man could foresee. The old sheriff poured himself another cup of coffee and settled back in his chair, wondering if he'd just sent his best deputy to his death. The sun was bleeding crimson across the horizon when Morrison crested the ridge overlooking Dry Hollow. What he saw below made his blood run cold. The town lay in an unnatural silence, smoke rising from several buildings like funeral pyres. But there were no bodies in the streets, no signs of battle, just an eerie emptiness that set his teeth on edge. Thunder snorted nervously beneath him, the horse's instincts picking up on something wrong in the air. Morrison patted the animal's neck, his own senses on high alert. In his years as a lawman, he'd learned to trust his gut, and right now it was telling him that Dry Hollow held secrets darker than the approaching night. Morrison guided Thunder down the winding trail, his hand never straying far from his gun. The path was treacherous in the fading light, loose rocks and hidden gullies waiting to claim the unwary. But Morrison had ridden worse trails in worse conditions, and Thunder was sure-footed as a mountain goat. The first thing that struck him as he entered the town proper was the smell. Not gunpowder or death, but something else. Something metallic and sharp that reminded him of the mining camps he'd visited in his younger days. The scent of heated metal and chemical processes that spoke of industry rather than violence. The main street stretched before him like a mouthful of broken teeth. Windows were boarded up, doors hung askew, and yet there were fresh horse tracks in the dust. Recent ones. Multiple riders coming and going with regularity that suggested this wasn't a town under siege, but one conducting business. Morrison's trained eye caught other details that didn't fit the narrative of a town under attack. The damage to the buildings was superficial. Broken windows and scattered debris, but no bullet holes in the walls, no burn marks from torches. It looked more like a stage set than a battlefield. "Hello!" Morrison called out, his voice echoing off the empty buildings. "Sheriff's Department!" A curtain twitched in an upstairs window, then another. Slowly, like prairie dogs emerging from their holes, the townspeople began to appear. Men with haunted eyes and nervous gestures, women clutching shawls tight around their shoulders despite the warm evening air. Children peering from behind their mothers' skirts with the wide-eyed fear of those who'd seen too much. An elderly man with a mare's chain around his neck stepped forward, his relief so palpable it was almost theatrical. You came. Thank God you came." Morrison dismounted, his eyes scanning the crowd, noting the way they clustered together, the way their gazes darted nervously between him and the shadows. "Mayor Harrison?" Yes. I'm Harrison." The mayor's handshake was damp with perspiration, his grip weak and trembling. "I'm Deputy Morrison." "Sheriff Bradley sent me." Harrison's relief seemed genuine enough, but Morrison caught the quick glance he exchanged with a well-dressed man standing near the saloon. A glance that spoke of prearranged signals and carefully rehearsed responses. "We sent that telegraph 3 days ago. We thought no one was coming." Harrison's voice carried just the right note of desperation. But Morrison had heard enough lies in his time to recognize the subtle artifice beneath the words. "What happened here? Where are the attackers?" The mayor's face darkened, and Morrison noticed how the crowd seemed to tense, as if waiting for a cue. "Gone, for now. But they'll be back. They always come back." Morrison noticed the way the townspeople exchanged glances, the way conversations died when he looked their way. There was fear here, certainly, but it wasn't the fear of people under siege. It was the fear of people keeping secrets. Who's they, Mayor? Bandits, Harrison said quickly, perhaps too quickly. Outlaws. They've been demanding tribute, protection money. But Morrison had been reading men's faces for too long to miss the lie. The mayor's eyes shifted left when he spoke, a telltale sign of deception that Morrison had learned to watch for. Show me where they attacked. Harrison led him through the town, pointing out damaged buildings, broken windows, scattered belongings. But Morrison's trained eye caught the inconsistencies. Bullet holes that went the wrong direction, damage that looked staged, fear in people's eyes that seemed directed at something other than external threats. The general store showed signs of ransacking, but the most valuable items, a case of fine whiskey, a display of silver jewelry, remained untouched. The bank's windows were broken, but the heavy safe stood unopened, its combination lock undamaged. These weren't the marks of desperate bandits seeking quick profit. As they walked, an old woman grabbed Morrison's sleeve with gnarled fingers that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. "You need to know," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible above the evening wind. "It ain't what they're telling you. The real danger, Mrs. Fletcher!" Harrison's voice cracked like a whip, sharp with authority and warning. "That's enough." The woman's eyes filled with terror, and she scurried away like a frightened mouse, but not before Morrison caught the desperate plea in her gaze. She wanted to tell him something important enough to risk whatever consequences Harrison's anger might bring. That evening, Harrison insisted Morrison stay at the hotel. The finest room, the best food, treatment fit for a king. The hotel keeper, a nervous man named Wilkins, showed him to a corner room on the second floor, apologizing profusely for the modest accommodations while serving him a meal that would have been impressive in San Francisco, let alone a frontier town. But Morrison noticed the way Wilkins's hands shook as he poured the wine, the way conversation stopped when he entered the dining room, the way the other guests, if they were guests, seemed to watch his every move with the intensity of predators studying prey. Late that night, as Morrison sat by his window cleaning his guns, he heard it, the sound of horses approaching. Many horses, their hooves muffled but not silent on the hard-packed earth. He blew out his lamp and peered through the curtains, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. A group of riders entered the town, but these weren't raiders or bandits. They moved with purpose, familiarity, like men returning home after a day's work. And the townspeople who emerged to meet them didn't cower in fear. They handed over bundles, packages, things that glinted silver in the moonlight. Morrison's blood turned to ice as he recognized what he was seeing. This wasn't a town under siege. This was a town with a secret. And that secret was about to get a lot more dangerous. Morrison waited until the mysterious riders departed before slipping out of the hotel. The town had returned to its deathly quiet, but now he understood the silence wasn't born of fear. It was born of guilt, the kind of guilt that came from compromising one's principles for survival or profit or both. He made his way to the telegraph office, his boots silent on the wooden boardwalk. Years of tracking dangerous men had taught him to move like a ghost when necessary, and tonight, stealth might mean the difference between uncovering the truth and ending up in an unmarked grave. The door was unlocked, a detail that struck Morrison as odd for a town supposedly under siege. Inside, he found what he was looking for, copies of outgoing messages carelessly left in a basket beside the telegraph key. His hands trembled as he read them by lamplight, each message painting a clearer picture of the deception. Shipment delayed. Increased security. Morrison arrived as planned. Package secured. Waiting further instructions. Sheriff's man asking questions. May need to accelerate timeline. The messages weren't signed, but they were all sent to the same destination. A mining operation 50 miles north called the Silver Crown Mine. Morrison's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. Dry Hollow wasn't under attack. It was a way station. a laundering operation for stolen silver. He photographed the messages with a small camera he carried for evidence gathering, then carefully replaced them exactly as he'd found them. As he worked, he noticed other details. A ledger hidden beneath the telegraph operator's desk, filled with columns of numbers and coded references that spoke of a sophisticated operation. A floorboard creaked behind him. Morrison spun, his gun clearing leather in one fluid motion, only to find himself facing a young woman with tears streaming down her face. She was perhaps 20, with the kind of beauty that belonged in a city drawing room rather than a frontier town. But her eyes held the hardness of someone who'd seen too much. "Don't shoot," she whispered, her hands raised but steady. "Please, I want to help." Morrison kept his gun trained on her, but his finger eased off the trigger. Something in her voice, a quality of desperation mixed with determination, told him she might be the ally he needed. "Who are you?" "Sarah Fletcher, Mrs. Fletcher's granddaughter." Her voice shook with emotion, but she met his gaze directly. "She sent me. Said you needed to know the truth." Morrison studied her face in the lamplight, looking for signs of deception. Her fear seemed genuine, but so had Mayor Harrison's earlier performance. "I'm listening." Sarah glanced nervously at the door before continuing, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It started 2 years ago. Men came to town, said they were investors, wanted to buy land, start a mining operation. But they weren't miners. They were thieves." Morrison holstered his gun, but remained alert, positioning himself where he could watch both Sarah and the door. "What kind of thieves?" "They rob silver shipments from the big mines up north, then bring it here to be melted down and recast. New stamps, new markings. By the time it leaves Dry Hollow, it's clean." Sarah's hands clenched into fists as she spoke, her knuckles white with tension. The operation was more sophisticated than Morrison had imagined. "And the town just goes along with it?" Sarah's laugh was bitter, filled with the kind of pain that came from watching good people make terrible choices. "They didn't give us a choice. First they offered money, good money. Times have been hard and people were desperate. The drought last year killed most of the crops, and the cattle were dying of some disease. When these men offered to pay families more in a month than they'd see in a year of farming," Morrison felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest. He'd seen it before. Desperate people forced into impossible situations by those with power and no conscience. But some refused? At first, yes. The preacher, some of the older families who'd built this town. They tried to organize resistance. Sarah's voice broke slightly. But when some folks tried to refuse, they made examples. Morrison's jaw tightened. "What kind of examples?" "The Hendersons. Family of 4, John, his wife Mary, and their 2 little girls. They tried to go to the territorial marshal, said they'd rather lose everything than be part of something criminal." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Found them burned out 3 days later, all of them dead. Made it look like an Apache raid, but we knew better. Apaches don't usually leave silver dollars scattered around the bodies. The pieces were falling into place now, painting a picture of systematic intimidation and murder. So the whole town's in on it, not by choice. They're trapped. The gang's got people everywhere, in the territorial government, in the marshal's office, even some of the army posts. Anyone who talks dies, and their families with them." Sarah's voice carried the weight of collective guilt and fear. Morrison studied her face in the lamplight, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the way she chose her words carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" "Why risk it?" "Because my grandmother's dying. Cancer. She says she won't meet her maker with this sin on her soul." Sarah's voice broke completely now, tears flowing freely. "And because they're planning something big. Something that's going to get a lot of innocent people killed." Morrison felt his blood chill. "What kind of something?" "There's a silver shipment coming through tomorrow. Biggest one ever, enough to buy a small army. 3 wagons full of refined silver from the territorial mint, bound for the railroad in Tucson. But this time, they're not just going to rob it. They're going to make it look like the town was attacked, everyone killed defending the shipment. Then they disappear with the silver, and Dry Hollow becomes a ghost town with no witnesses. Morrison's blood ran cold as the full scope of the plan became clear. "Including me?" Sarah nodded, her face pale in the lamplight. "You were supposed to be the perfect witness. A lawman who could testify that the town was under siege, that everyone died fighting off raiders. Your word would make the whole story believable. But now I know too much." Morrison checked his guns, his mind already working on a plan. The odds were impossible, but he'd faced impossible odds before. "How many of them are there?" 12 in the gang, plus maybe 6 or 7 townspeople who are in deep enough to kill for them. Men who've done things they can't take back, who know they'll hang if the truth comes out. 18 to 1. Morrison had faced worse odds, but not often, and never with the lives of an entire town hanging in the balance. "When's this shipment coming?" "Dawn. They'll hit it just outside town, then circle back to finish off anyone who might talk. They've got it all planned out. Make it look like a desperate last stand. Heroes dying to protect innocent people." Morrison looked at this brave young woman who was risking everything to do what was right. In her, he saw something he'd almost forgotten existed, the kind of courage that came not from desperation or anger, but from simple moral conviction. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me. Can you get word to the people you trust? The ones who are only going along because they're scared. Some of them, maybe. The ones who still have souls left." Her voice carried a note of hope for the first time. "Why? Because come dawn, we're going to give these bastards a fight they'll never forget." The pre-dawn darkness clung to Dry Hollow like a shroud as Morrison made his final preparations. Sarah had done her work well. 12 townspeople had agreed to stand and fight, including her grandmother despite her illness. They weren't gunfighters, but they were desperate people with nothing left to lose. And Morrison had learned that desperation could make even shopkeepers and farmers dangerous. Morrison had spent the night turning the town into a fortress. Barricades at key intersections, rifle positions in upper windows, escape routes planned for the non-combatants. He'd used every trick he'd learned in his years of law enforcement. Every lesson taught by survival in a hostile land. The volunteers were a mixed group. Tom Brennan, the blacksmith, whose massive arms could swing a hammer or aim a rifle with equal precision. Doc Holliday, no relation to the famous gunfighter, whose steady surgeon's hands made him a natural marksman. Martha Kowalski, the widow who ran the boarding house and had buried 2 husbands to frontier violence. And others whose quiet lives had been shattered by circumstances beyond their control. Morrison had positioned them carefully, taking advantage of the town's layout. The main street formed a natural killing ground, with the church bell tower providing an excellent sniper's nest and the general store's 2nd floor offering commanding views of the approaches. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As the first pale light touched the eastern hills, Morrison heard it, the thunder of approaching hooves. The silver shipment was coming, right on schedule, with the gang lying in wait just beyond the ridge. He could picture them now, hidden among the rocks and scrub brush, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Remember," Morrison called softly to his makeshift army, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "We're not trying to win a war. We just need to survive long enough for help to arrive." Mrs. Fletcher, propped up in a chair by her window with an old Spencer rifle that had seen service in the war between the states, managed a weak smile. Despite her illness, her eyes were bright with determination. "Help? What help?" Morrison touched the telegraph key he'd been working all night, sending carefully coded messages to contacts throughout the territory. "I sent some messages of my own. Should be interesting to see who shows up." The sound of gunfire erupted from beyond the town, the gang hitting the silver shipment. Morrison counted the shots, timing the attack. The plan was proceeding exactly as Sarah had described, a quick, brutal assault on the wagons, followed by a return to town to eliminate witnesses. From his position behind the overturned wagon that served as his primary barricade, Morrison could see the dust cloud rising from the attack site. The silver shipment's guards were putting up a fight, but they were outnumbered and caught by surprise. It would be over soon, and then the real battle would begin. "Here they come," Sarah whispered from her position in the millinery shop, her voice tight with fear, but steady with resolve. The gang thundered into town like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, guns blazing, expecting to find terrified townspeople cowering in their homes. Instead, they rode into a crossfire that dropped 3 of them. Before they knew what hit them, Morrison's first shot took the gang leader clean off his horse, a bearded giant of a man whose reputation for cruelty had preceded him. His second shattered the shoulder of a man trying to torch the general store, sending him tumbling from his saddle with a scream of pain and rage. Around him, the townspeople fought with the fury of the desperate, their shots wild but effective in the confined space of the main street. Tom Brennan's rifle boomed like thunder from the blacksmith shop, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly accurate. Doc Holliday worked his way through the gang's wounded with the same methodical precision he brought to surgery, except now he was dealing death instead of healing. "Fall back," someone shouted from the gang's ranks. "It's a trap." But Morrison wasn't about to let them regroup. He vaulted over his barricade, his guns spitting fire as he advanced down the street. A bullet tugged at his hat, another burned across his ribs, but he kept moving, kept shooting, driven by a cold fury that had been building for years. The gang tried to rally around the saloon, using the building's thick walls for cover, but Morrison had anticipated that. Sarah and 2 other townspeople had positioned themselves on the roof across the street, and their rifle fire made the saloon untenable. Every time one of the gang members showed himself, a bullet would crack past his head or punch through the wooden walls. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Morrison found himself face to face with a young gunfighter who couldn't have been more than 20, his eyes wild with fear and desperation. For a moment, time seemed suspended as they stared at each other across the dusty street. "Don't have to die today, son," Morrison said quietly. His gun trained on the young man's chest. The gunfighter's hand twitched toward his weapon, then stopped. Something in Morrison's eyes, perhaps the weight of experience, perhaps simple compassion, made him reconsider. He raised his hands slowly, his gun falling to the dust. When the smoke cleared, 8 gang members lay dead in the dust, and the rest had fled into the desert, wounded and broken. The great silver robbery had become a massacre, but not the one they'd planned. Morrison stood in the middle of the street, his guns empty, his body aching from a dozen minor wounds. Around him, the townspeople emerged from their hiding places, their faces showing a mixture of relief, pride, and something else: hope. For the first time in 2 years, they had stood up to their oppressors and won. "Is it over?" Mayor Harrison asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man who had seemed so confident the night before now looked old and broken, the weight of his complicity finally crushing down on him. "For now," Morrison replied, reloading his weapons with practiced efficiency. "But they'll be back, and next time—" The sound of approaching horses cut him off. Morrison tensed, ready for another fight. But these riders carried a different banner, the territorial marshal's star, gleaming in the morning sun like a beacon of hope. Marshal Williams rode into town with a dozen deputies, his face grim as he surveyed the carnage. He was a tall, lean man, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in the saddle, chasing outlaws across impossible terrain. "Deputy Morrison, Sheriff Bradley sent word you might need assistance." Morrison allowed himself a small smile, the first genuine expression of pleasure he'd felt in days. "Right on time, Marshal. Though I think the worst is over." Williams dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene with the practiced gaze of a veteran lawman. The bodies in the street, the bullet-scarred buildings, the faces of the townspeople, all told a story of violence and redemption that he'd seen played out in a dozen frontier towns. "We intercepted some interesting telegraph messages last night. Seems this little town's been busier than anyone realized." Over the next hour, Morrison filled the marshal in on everything: the silver laundering operation, the intimidation, the planned massacre. Williams listened with growing anger, making notes and asking sharp questions that revealed a keen intelligence behind his frontier facade. "We'll need statements from everyone," Williams said finally, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "And we'll want to track down those gang members who escaped. Can't have them regrouping somewhere else. What about the townspeople?" Morrison asked, thinking of Sarah and her grandmother, of Tom Brennan and Doc Holliday, and all the others who had been forced into an impossible situation. Most of them were just trying to survive. Williams considered this, his weathered face thoughtful. "Cooperation will go a long way toward leniency. Sounds like they've suffered enough. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "seems like they've already paid their debt in blood." As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Morrison prepared to leave. His job here was done, and Sheriff Bradley would be waiting for his report. But more than that, he felt a strange sense of completion, as if some long-carried burden had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Sarah approached him as he saddled Thunder, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had lived through a nightmare and emerged into daylight. "What happens now? Now you rebuild. Clean slate, fresh start." Morrison checked his cinch, then looked at her seriously. "But remember, freedom ain't free. You've got to be willing to fight for it every single day," Mrs. Fletcher called out from her porch, her voice stronger than it had been in months, as if the act of standing up for what was right had given her new life. "Deputy Morrison, thank you for giving us back our souls." Morrison touched his hat brim in acknowledgement, then swung into the saddle. As he rode out of Dry Hollow, he could hear the sounds of a town coming back to life, hammers ringing as people began to repair the damage, voices calling out greetings and plans, children laughing as they played in the street without fear for the first time in 2 years. The silver star on his chest caught the morning light, and for the first time in years, Morrison felt something he'd almost forgotten: pride. Not in the killing, not in the violence, but in the simple act of standing up for what was right, of giving people back their dignity and their hope. Behind him, Dry Hollow began the long process of healing. Ahead of him, Sheriff Bradley waited with coffee and questions. And somewhere in between, Jake Morrison, the man who'd once worn a noose around his neck, had found something the Old West rarely offered anyone: redemption. 6 months later, Dry Hollow had become a thriving community once again. The silver operation was shut down permanently. The surviving gang members were behind bars awaiting trial, and the townspeople had learned that sometimes the greatest courage comes not from a gun, but from standing up and saying no more. Sarah Fletcher had taken over as the town's new mayor, her grandmother having passed peacefully in her sleep just a month after the battle, her conscience finally clear. The town prospered under Sarah's leadership, attracting honest settlers and legitimate businesses that brought new life to the desert community. As for Jake Morrison, he continued to ride for Sheriff Bradley until the old man's retirement, then pinned on the star himself. They say he never spoke much about what happened in Dry Hollow, but every year on the anniversary, a package would arrive, silver dollars for the church fund, with no return address, because in the Old West, redemption wasn't something you found. It was something you earned, one right choice at a time. If this story of courage and redemption moved you, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales from the American frontier. Hit that like button, share with your friends, and let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Jake Morrison's boots? Until next time, keep riding toward the sunset.